The colonel's hand, which was lifting a coffee cup, just stopped in midair. The entire lounge seemed to fall silent at the same time. It was so quiet I could clearly hear the ice cubes shift in a glass across the room. The young attendant at the desk was still blocking my path, looking pointedly at my casual clothes, jeans and worn-out sneakers, which clearly didn't meet his standards for this place. Then the colonel spoke so quietly I almost didn't hear him, but the words seemed to change the feeling in the room. "Ma'am, the ghost of Kilo team." I didn't say anything right away. In a place like this, surrounded by people who understood, sometimes the best response is just to wait. Just 30 minutes before, I was like any other tired traveler at Dulles, dragging a carry-on bag with a wheel that had given up somewhere between my last post and Boston. The sign above the lounge door clearly read, "Active duty, authorized access only." The kid at the desk saw my denim jacket and just assumed I was a civilian who couldn't read. "Ma'am, this section is for active duty personnel only," he said politely enough. But it was the assumption that stung. I slid my military ID across the counter. He didn't even bother to pick it up. "Good thing I still am," I said. He looked skeptical. "Really? What branch?" "Navy Fleet Operations," I told him. He blinked as if the words were in English but didn't make sense together. He probably pictured me pushing papers, filing forms in an office somewhere while the real work happened out on the ocean. He opened his mouth to argue with me, but that's when the colonel turned. He didn't make a big movement. He just rotated in his chair, set his cup down on the table without looking, and studied me. He had the kind of gaze that looked right through you, the way you look at the sky when you know the weather's about to turn. He wore a gray jacket over an old unit t-shirt, and I could see a West Point ring on a knuckle that looked like it had been broken more than once. He knew. You can always tell when someone really knows, because they don't get flustered. They just stand there in the quiet with you. "Ma'am, the ghost of Kilo team," he said again. His voice was soft, but it carried. The attendant at the desk looked back and forth between us, trying to understand what was happening. I could have broken the tension with a joke, or I could have pulled rank, using a title I hadn't said out loud in years. Instead, I just let the moment sit there. An old chief taught me that a long time ago. If the ocean is trying to tell you something, you don't talk over it. "I used to be," I said finally. It wasn't a boast and it wasn't a confession. It was just a fact. A woman 2 seats over, wearing a Korea veteran baseball cap, lifted her chin slightly in recognition. Across from her, a man reading a paperback had a sleeve that was empty above the elbow. This lounge wasn't just a room anymore. It was a shared space for people who had all carried heavy things for a long time. The attendant swallowed hard. I didn't mean—" "It's all right," I told him, cutting him off gently. "You asked the right question." He looked confused, so I explained. Which branch a person serves in matters a lot more than what kind of jacket they're wearing. He cleared his throat, finally picked up my ID, and actually looked at it. His shoulders relaxed. He swiped the card and the lock on the door buzzed open. "Welcome in," he said, and this time he clearly meant it. The colonel didn't smile, but he gave me a single nod. It was a gesture that said everything at once. Approval, an apology for the kid, and an understanding of what I'd been through. He pointed toward an empty chair and I took it. "Long flight?" he asked. "Long enough," I replied. "Home feels a lot farther than just the miles." He glanced at my broken carry-on. "Lose a wheel or win a fight?" "A little of both," I said. We let the quiet settle in for a minute, and then we both smiled. He didn't ask me what fleet operations really meant. He didn't have to. People from his generation of service understood that titles were just small labels for very large responsibilities. Ships don't move because someone gives a speech. They move because someone is keeping the calculations steady while the weather is trying to prove them wrong. "Heading home?" he asked. "Maine," I answered. "My dad runs a fishing charter. He had a heart scare recently. I figured I should show up instead of just calling." "He's a good man, then." "The best," I agreed. "He taught me how to tie knots with my eyes closed." "Then you'll be all right," the colonel said. He wasn't talking about my flight. The miles toward home always feel heavier. I could already feel the weight of all the conversations I had put off for years. always because someone else's life or death situation was more important. On the deck of an aircraft carrier, everything is loud and demands your attention right now. Back home, it's the quiet that can undo you. Two new officers came into the lounge, read the sign, rolled their eyes at the civilian clothes, and then immediately went quiet when they noticed the man with the missing arm. The old Marine in the corner just lifted his paper cup in a small, silent toast. I pulled out my phone and stared at a text I hadn't opened. My brother David had sent a picture of my dad's old boat, the Clara, tied up at a different dock. The caption just said, "He had to sell it, we'll explain." The timestamp was from midnight. I could already hear the argument. I put the phone face down on my lap. "You'll handle it," the colonel said, just stating it as a fact, like he was telling me the weather would pass. "How do you know, Bus?" I asked. "Because you didn't answer me in that first minute," he said. "You let the room catch up to the truth. People who need to be right all the time talk fast. People who plan to do the right thing take their time." I wanted to tell him a lot of things. Instead, I just asked, "What's your gate?" "Same as yours," he said, and I felt a small bit of relief. The attendant came back a few minutes later with a bottle of water and set it on the table by my elbow. It felt like a peace offering. "Thank you for your service," he said. It wasn't the automatic canned version you always hear. It sounded like something he had just decided for himself. "Thank you for learning," I said. Soon, they called our flight for boarding. When my name was called over the speaker, the attendant stood up straight. "Ma'am," he said, and there was a whole lesson in that one word. It wasn't about the ID card or the door clicking open. It was about respect. I nodded, grabbed my one-wheeled bag, and stood up. As I passed the colonel, he started to stand out of reflex. I put a hand on his shoulder. "Save your knees," I said. "Save your heart," he replied. Outside the quiet lounge, the noise of the terminal rushed back in. Kids were begging for pretzels. A TSA bin rattled on the floor, and a country song was leaking from someone's headphones. I let the crowd carry me toward the gate, thinking about the kid at the desk, the woman with the Korea cap, the man with the missing arm, and the way a single, quiet sentence could make a whole room stop and listen. The gate agent scanned my pass. "Enjoy your flight, Commander." "Thank you," I said. "I intend to." They called me the Ghost of Kilo Team because I survived a mission that nobody was supposed to survive. I didn't choose the name, but I didn't fight it either. The Navy has a way of naming you after the silence that follows an event. I was 26 when the orders for Operation Deepwater came through. We were in the Arabian Sea. My call sign was Halo 2, and I was serving as the Fleet Operations Liaison for a SEAL extraction unit. Our job was to coordinate the boat approach to get a captured recon team out. The night was perfectly dark and filled with static. Every single move had to be precise. Mark was my co-pilot, and he was also my fiancé. His call sign was Falcon. He had one of those grins that could cut right through the tension on the comms. When the mission started to go wrong, and they always go wrong at some point, he told me, "If we make it home, I'm building that porch before you can build another excuse to leave." I smiled, thinking he was just trying to lighten the mood. He wasn't. The explosion was devastating. It tore away half of the helicopter, and it took Mark with it. I'll never forget the color of the fuel burning on the water. It was blue, not red. The SEAL team managed to get out only because Mark had used the last of his strength to pull the helicopter to the side. When I regained consciousness, I was half in the water, with the sound of the sea hissing as it hit the hot, torn metal. After that, I was given a medal, a new nickname, and a kind of deep quiet inside me that has never really gone away. Back in the States, my mother couldn't even look at my uniform without crying, thinking about the wedding ring that never made it home. My father asked me once, "Was it worth it?" I told him, "Yes." He never asked me again. That's how fathers and daughters in military families learn to talk. Once with total honesty, and then you move on before the words can break something else. I stayed in the Navy. The promotions came faster than any peace of mind did. They eventually made me operations commander for the fleet's liaison teams, which meant I coordinated missions between surface ships, submarines, and SEAL task units. Most days, it just felt like I was trying to solve storms. People think revenge in the military is all about fire and anger, but sometimes revenge is just doing the paperwork right so that a man's widow gets her benefits before Christmas. Sometimes it's walking into a hearing and saying, "No, sir, they were following their orders." My kind of revenge was fixing the things that chaos had tried to ruin. Every time I signed off on a mission file, I thought about Mark's handwriting on our last flight log. I could still see the small curve of his R's, so calm and steady. I kept one page from that log in my locker until the ink started to bleed from the salt air and the years. The Ghost nickname stuck after a reporter at Norfolk got a hold of the mission's casualty list. The ghost who brought the team home, the headline read. The Navy hated it. I hated it more. You can't bury a man and then live under a name that reminds you of him every day. But inside the community, it eventually turned into a quiet kind of respect. SEALs are superstitious. They like to think some people carry luck that's heavier than their armor. Mine wasn't luck, it was just duty. But they saluted it all the same. Years passed. New deployments, but always the same horizon. I kept flying, kept coordinating, and kept pretending the sky still sounded the same as it used to. Then one morning, I was standing on the deck of a carrier off the coast of Guam, and I realized I hadn't actually heard the ocean in years. I'd only heard the noise of command. That's when I asked for a reassignment. Fleet Operations offered me a desk job. I took it, feeling half grateful and half guilty. My work changed to coastal logistics, monitoring East Coast response protocols, and coordinating disaster relief. Sometimes I even ran rescue training for small-town sheriffs who didn't trust Navy input until they saw what precision planning looked like. That's how I started hearing my hometown's name again, Rockport, Maine. It would come up in storm path projections, tide reports, and small port advisories. The town where I grew up, where my dad, Robert, ran a charter boat called the Clara, and where my younger brother, David, still blamed me for missing every Thanksgiving since 2008. Last spring, I found a voicemail from him. "Dad's getting tired," he'd said. "He won't say it, but he is. Maybe you should come home while it still means something." I replayed that message more times than I'd ever admit. Then I booked my leave. That's how I ended up in jeans at an airport, carrying one broken suitcase and a promise that was long overdue. The colonel from the lounge wasn't the first person to recognize me. Once, at a diner near Coronado, a retired chief paid my check. As he slid it away, he just said, "You still owe the sea a drink." I nodded and left 2 quarters on the counter, an old Navy tradition. Recognition never feels comfortable. It's like looking in a mirror you didn't ask for, one that shows you a life you only lived in fragments. That night after the airport, I sat by my hotel window overlooking the runways. I watched the planes take off and disappear into the clouds. I tried to imagine what Mark would say if he saw me now, with streaks of gray in my hair, my uniform folded neatly in a garment bag, still chasing conversations that were unfinished. Maybe he'd laugh. Maybe he'd tell me I did all right. I opened my phone and scrolled past David's new message. "Boat's been acting up. Dad won't stop pushing himself. Just come home, Anna." The word home hit me harder than any explosion ever had. I booked the first flight to Portland, packed the few things I had, and told myself I was ready. The Navy had taught me how to manage a crisis, but it never taught me how to just arrive quietly. The next morning, as the plane leveled out over the Atlantic, the flight attendant's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Maine." Descent. That felt like the right word. I looked out the window at the endless blue water and thought, maybe the only way to make peace with the past is to stop flying above it. Rockport hadn't changed much in 10 years, just the faces, which had grown older while they were waiting for me. The harbor still smelled like diesel fuel and low tide. The lobster traps were still stacked like crooked teeth along the dock, and the same American flag was still hanging from the same bent pole outside Tide Runner Charters. My father's business, his pride, and his entire world. When the taxi pulled up, I told the driver I'd walk the last block. It felt right to arrive on my own 2 feet. My boots crunched on the gravel, which was stiff with dried salt. The wind coming off the water was sharp enough to taste. Through the fogged-up window of the boathouse, I saw my father. His hair was gray now, his shoulders smaller, and his breath looked heavy in the cold air, but he was still inspecting every rope like it personally owed him something. He didn't see me at first. My brother David did. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, wearing the same impatient frown he'd had since we were kids. He looked like Dad used to, broad shoulders, a sunburned neck, but he didn't have the patience that was always behind Dad's eyes. Well, look who the tide washed in, he said. Fleet operations in the flesh. Hi, David. He didn't move from the doorway. We were starting to think the Navy lost you. Not yet, I said, forcing a small smile. How's Dad? Same as before you left, he said. Stubborn, tired, and won't stop working. Dad turned around then, his eyes found me, and they softened for just a second before he caught himself. Anna. I dropped my duffel bag and hugged him. He smelled like salt and engine grease, just like always. His ribs felt smaller under my arms. Still keeping the old girl afloat? I asked, nodding toward the boat. She's got more rust than wood these days, but she floats. That's something. David grunted. Barely. Costs more to fix her than to scrap her. Dad shot him a look. You don't scrap a boat that's been through more storms than you have birthdays. I laughed softly, and for just a second it felt like we were three people who still understood each other. Then the moment passed. Inside the office, the radio was playing a country station that kept fading in and out. The coffee pot hissed, long empty. Photos lined the wall, fishing trips, my Navy graduation, and one picture of Mom before the chemo took her smile. Dad pointed for me to sit. You eatin'? I can wait. Then you'll wait too long. He poured some chowder into a chipped bowl and slid it across the counter. His hands were trembling just slightly. David watched us, silent, until my spoon clinked against the bowl. You here for good or just passing through again? I'm on leave, I said. I figured I'd help out while Dad's recovering. He snorted. Help out? What, are you going to run the charter boats between drone strikes? David, Dad warned. It's fine, I said. I can handle sarcasm better than I handle storms. David leaned closer. You always could. That's the problem. You handle everything except being here. The words hit harder than I let on. I took another spoonful of chowder, but it tasted more like salt than anything else. Dad broke the silence. David's been keeping the business running. Mostly. Mostly? I asked. He sighed. Bookings are down. The engine repairs are up. We had to sell the small skiff last spring. David just shrugged. You were busy flying jets, remember? Coordinating ships, I corrected him quietly. Same difference to the people who have to pay the bills. I set my spoon down. I sent money, David. Yeah, and you sent medals too. Dad keeps them in a drawer under the tax receipts. Enough, Dad said sharply. This house has seen enough fighting to last a lifetime. No one spoke for a while. The static from the radio seemed to fill in the cracks. Later, I followed Dad outside. The air carried that sweet, rotting smell of low tide. He sat down on a crate, breathing slowly. I didn't raise you two to keep score, he said. I know, I whispered. He's angry because you remind him of what he didn't get to become. He loves you anyway. I'm not sure he remembers how. Dad chuckled softly. Neither did I after your mother died. Sometimes loving someone just looks like yelling at them from the wrong direction. We watched the gulls fighting over scraps on the water. The wind was picking up, colder now. You'll find your way back, Anna, he said. Us, son, just don't expect it to be quick. I never did. He smiled. That's why I trust you to steer when things get ugly. That night, I slept in my old room above the shop. The walls still had the faint outline of where my Navy poster used to hang. The window faced the harbor, just like before. Outside, I could hear the creaking of the moorings and the slow, rhythmic sound of the boats brushing against the dock. Somewhere below, I heard David moving around, closing up the shop. The floorboards carried his weight, same heavy steps, same resentment. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the colonel from the airport, about the way his voice softened when he said my name. Respect used to feel like armor. Now it just reminded me how thin it could get. Before I fell asleep, I texted David a simple line. Thanks for holding things together. He didn't reply. There was just the hum of the sea against the shore, as steady as a memory. In the morning, I found a note taped to the coffee pot. Boat inspection at 9 o'clock. If you're still in town, maybe you can explain why the Coast Guard thinks we're behind on our paperwork. I smiled in spite of myself. Revenge, I thought, doesn't always start with anger. Sometimes it just starts with a clipboard. By Saturday morning, the word had spread all over town that I was back in Rockport. Small towns don't need phone trees. They have coffee counters and gossip currents that are stronger than the tide. At the diner near the harbor, a waitress named Maria still ran the morning shift. She froze when she saw me. Anna Hale, Lord, you look just like your mama. If your mama could glare a storm into behaving. Good to see you too, Maria. Your dad's still chasing lobsters and pretending he's 30. Still winning about half the time, I said. She laughed, poured me a cup of coffee, and then leaned in closer. He brags about you, you know. But folks around here, they stopped listening after the papers called you the ghost. They don't understand it. Neither did I said. She set the pot down. Don't let them forget. People need to be reminded what service actually looks like. Outside, the gulls were circling over the harbor. David was loading gear onto the charter boat with 2 local kids, Jake and Mike, who looked like they were fresh out of high school. Both wore Red Sox caps and had the easy arrogance of boys who haven't learned yet that the ocean always keeps its own score. Morning, I said. Jake smirked. You're Navy, right? Guess that means a lot of paperwork and coffee runs. Mike elbowed him. Dude, that's the Marines. The Navy just gives them rides. David shot them a look but didn't actually stop them. Maybe he wanted me to hear it. I walked over, nice and steady. You ever been on a deck during a storm, Jake? He shrugged. Just during lobster season. Nothing crazy. Then you've never been Navy, I said. David's jaw tightened. She's just visiting, boys. Don't worry about it. Visiting? I repeated very softly. Yeah, that's what I do. The inspection officer from the Coast Guard arrived just as the air was getting sharp with sea spray. She looked to be about 30, polite, but all business. I'm Lieutenant Ortiz. I'm here about the overdue compliance forms and the maintenance log. David muttered, paperwork again. I took the clipboard from him. I'll handle it. Ortiz looked at me, sizing me up. Do you have experience with maritime protocols? Fleet operations, U.S. Navy, I said. Her posture changed instantly. Ma'am. David rolled his eyes. Here we go. Relax, I told him. It's not about rank. It's about familiarity. We speak the same language. Within an hour, I had the log squared away and the inspection passed. Ortiz shook my hand before she left. Pleasure working with you, Commander Hale. David waited until her car was gone. You always have to make it look so easy. It's not easy, I said. It's just practiced. He didn't answer. That afternoon, Dad insisted we all go to the Veterans Day cookout at the town green. Old Man Peterson's grilling. It would be rude not to show up. David grumbled, but he went. The park was full of folding chairs and the smell of charcoal. Small American flags lined the fence. Kids were chasing each other between the picnic tables. For a moment, I thought maybe the town hadn't changed as much as I feared. Then I started to catch the glances, quick, assessing, and curious. They weren't hostile, just uncertain, like they were trying to match the person in front of them with the headlines they'd read. A man near the food line said quietly to another, "That's her. The ghost thing." Yeah, I thought she quit after that crash. I pretended not to hear them, but Dad didn't. His shoulders squared, his old pride flickering through his tired body. A teenager who was handing out paper plates laughed to his friend. I guess the Navy has influencers now. Before I could say anything, an elderly Marine in a faded cap stepped forward. Watch your mouth, son. The kid blinked. Sir? The old Marine pointed his plastic fork at me. You see that woman? She ran the operations that pulled men out of hell. You hand her that plate like you'd hand her a flag. The park went quiet. The boy swallowed hard and offered me the plate with both hands. Thank you, I said gently. And thank him too. That's how this works. Applause started in one corner, small at first, but then it rolled through the crowd. Dad looked away, blinking a little too much. David just stood still, his hands in his pockets, his expression impossible to read. Afterward, a few people came over to shake my hand. Some apologized for believing the old rumors. Most of them just said, "Welcome home," when the sun started to drop. Dad insisted on leaving early. On the walk back, David lagged behind, silent. Finally, he said, "You liked that, didn't you? The salute, the applause, makes up for missing Mom's funeral." I stopped walking. The streetlights hadn't come on yet, so his face was half in shadow, half in regret. "That's not fair," I said quietly. "Neither was growing up with an empty seat at every single table," he shot back. I let his words hang there because arguing would only make them feel more permanent. He walked ahead. Back home, Dad sat at the kitchen table, looking tired. "He doesn't mean it," he said. "Yes, he does," I replied, "but he'll mean something else tomorrow." Dad smiled sadly. "That's family. The tide always turns." Later, as I was cleaning the dishes, I thought about the applause and the way it felt like closure and guilt all at the same time. Recognition isn't always a reward. Sometimes it's just proof that people are finally seeing what you never stopped being. I looked out the window at the dark water. The boats swayed like they were breathing. Somewhere out there was the line between duty and forgiveness. I just hadn't found it yet. I woke up before dawn to the smell of diesel and the sound of a wrench slipping on metal. The air inside the boathouse was cold enough to see my breath. David was already there, bent over the old patrol boat Dad had named the Clara after Mom. He didn't look up when I came in. "You ever sleep?" I asked. "Not when I've got debt breathing down my neck." I stepped closer. "Debt?" He exhaled and rubbed his forehead with the back of a grease-streaked hand. "The charter business hasn't paid its own bills in months. The fuel costs alone. You should have told me." "Why? So you could fix it from 1,000 miles away?" He stood up straight, tossing the wrench onto the bench. "You always swoop in with your rank and your solutions. It doesn't work like that here." "Then tell me how it works." He glared at me, his jaw tight. "It works like real people trying to stay afloat while the Navy turns its heroes into headlines. You're famous, Anna, but around here, fame doesn't fill the gas tanks." I didn't answer. He wasn't entirely wrong. Later that day, Dad called us both into the office. "You two need to talk about the boat," he said. "David wants to sell it." My heart sank. "You're kidding." "It's just a hunk of wood, Anna," David said. It could cover our bills for the winter." "That boat was Mom's last wish," I said quietly. "You remember what she said before she passed?" He shrugged. "She said to keep the family safe." This is me keeping the family safe. Dad slammed his palm against the desk. "Enough. This boat has carried this family for longer than either of you." The anger in his voice cracked, and he bent over in a deep coughing fit. I rushed to his side, steadying him until it passed. When he waved me off, I saw the fear he always tried to hide behind his stubbornness. David turned away. "We'll talk later." But later never came. By the following morning, the Clara was gone. I stood on the dock, staring at the empty slip. The ropes had been cut clean. A slip receipt from Camden Marine Sales was nailed to the post. The ink was still wet. Dad came out, saw the empty space, and went pale. "He didn't." "He did," I said. He sank onto a crate. "That boat was your mother's heart." "I'll get it back." "How?" "The same way we got through every mission," I said. "By finding the trail." Camden Marine was 20 miles south, a low building with a gravel lot and a dozen boats waiting for new names. Inside, a man in a ball cap looked up from his paperwork. "You the buyer?" he asked. "No, Sin," flashing my ID. The sister? He hesitated. Look, we bought it fair and square. The kid said he had the authority. I'm not questioning the sale, I said. I just need to know where it went. He squinted at his clipboard. Private collector. Didn't leave a full name, just initials. EJ. Can you give me a number? He shook his head. Privacy laws. I slid a photo across the counter. It was a younger me, in uniform, standing beside the Clara. Mom was smiling on the dock behind us. She's not a collector's item, I said. Something in his face shifted. You're that Hale. Depends on what you've read. He nodded slowly. The boat's still in the yard. The papers haven't cleared the bank yet. Tell you what, come back tomorrow. I'll hold it, no promises. I thanked him, left, and sat in my truck until the ache in my chest eased. Anger would have been easier, but anger is loud. Revenge works best when it's quiet. That night, I called in an old favor. Fleet Operations Command, Boston District, a familiar voice answered. Commander Hale, I said. I need a check on a registration transfer, the Clara. It's a 32-foot FFT patrol model sitting in the Camden lot. Still running rescues, huh? The voice on the other end teased. Something like that, I said. The next morning, when I pulled up to Camden Marine, the dealer was waiting for me. Got a message from the Coast Guard, he said. Said there's a hold on all transfers involving the Hale vessel. Paperwork glitch, maybe. The boat's yours until they clear it. I smiled. I appreciate the help. Back at our dock, the Clara looked tired but proud. I ran my hand along her side. The paint was blistered, but the hull was sturdy. You're home, I whispered. David showed up an hour later, furious. What did you do? I did what you should have done, I said. I protected what matters. You had no right. I had every right, I said quietly. You don't sell a legacy to pay the rent. You fix what's broken. He shook his head. You always think you're saving people. Maybe you just like being in control. I stepped closer. You're right, I do like control because the alternative is chaos, and I've buried too many people in chaos. For a moment, his face softened. Then his pride took over again. You think that boat is your revenge? Fine, enjoy it. It's not revenge, I said. It's a rescue. I hired 2 local vets, Ben's father, who was a former Coast Guard chief, and an old SEAL diver named Harris to help me restore the Clara. We replaced the engine, polished the hull, and painted her name back on in white script. When we launched her again, half the town came down to watch. Even the mayor showed up, curious about the Navy woman who was turning a relic into a rescue boat. I didn't make any speeches. I just handed the keys to Harris and said, "First mission is yours. Flood season is coming." That night, the news spread fast. Retired commander turns family boat into coastal rescue unit. By dawn, the phone at the shop wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. I declined all of them. I wasn't doing it for the headlines. At breakfast, Dad smiled for the first time in weeks. Your mother would have liked that. David didn't join us. He'd left a note on the counter. Don't wait up. I looked at his handwriting, angry, rushed, but familiar. I folded it once and slid it into my jacket. Forgiveness isn't something you're owed, it's something you earn. But sometimes you have to start by giving it before it's even been asked for. 2 weeks later, winter came early. The ocean stiffened with a wind that carried salt like knives, and the sky turned the color of steel by noon. The Clara, our patched-up rescue boat, had already saved 2 stranded fishermen off Vinalhaven, and people in town started talking again. Only this time, the talk was soft and respectful. Dad's health was holding steady, though he got tired faster. He sat at the dock most days, wrapped in a Navy blanket, watching the Clara bob on the water like a heartbeat he had given back to the world. Sometimes I'd catch him wiping his eyes, pretending it was just the wind. David hadn't come around since our argument. He left the business's account books on the counter and had vanished somewhere between his pride and his shame. Every morning, I hoped he'd walk in. Every night, I convinced myself he would tomorrow. Then, one gray afternoon, I heard my name shouted across the pier. "Commander Hale!" I turned. The same colonel from the airport, Colonel Harrison, was stepping out of a black SUV. He wore his dress coat buttoned high against the cold. Behind him, two younger officers carried a folder and a velvet box. "Sir," I said. He smiled. "Didn't expect to find you in flannel, ma'am. Mind if I intrude?" Dad pushed himself up from his chair, saluting out of habit. The colonel waved it off gently. "I came on behalf of the Navy's Eastern Fleet Command," he said. "The department recently reviewed the commendations related to Operation Deep Water." My throat went dry. "That was years ago?" "Too many," he said. "You were never officially recognized for your coordination under fire. The board decided it was time to fix that." He nodded to the officer beside him, who opened the box. Inside, resting on the velvet, was the Navy Commendation Medal. Dad gasped softly. "Lord above." I just stared at it. "I don't need—" The colonel cut me off. "But you don't. But we do. The younger ones need to know who got them home." He unpinned the medal and attached it just above my jacket pocket, right over an old stain I'd never managed to scrub out. For a moment, the dock was silent except for the sound of the water slapping against the wood. When he stepped back, I saw David. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face impossible to read. Our eyes met, and for the first time in years, he didn't look away. The colonel nodded toward him. "Family is complicated," I said. He smiled. "Most things worth keeping are." Then he turned to my father. "Your daughter's reputation preceded her, sir. Some of my men still tell the story of the ghost who brought them home." Dad's voice cracked. "That's my girl." The colonel gave me a salute, sharp and slow. I returned it, my fingers trembling a little in the cold. Then he left as quietly as he'd come, leaving behind a hush that felt heavier than applause. That night, I found David sitting by the boat, his hood up, staring at the reflection of the Clara in the dark water. "Didn't think you'd show up," I said. "Didn't think I should," he replied. "Figured you'd earn some peace without me ruining it." I sat down beside him, close enough to feel the cold coming off his jacket. "You didn't ruin anything." He laughed softly. "I sold the boat." "You made a mistake," I said. "You'd fixed plenty of them before that." He shook his head. "I didn't fix this. You did. You always do." "I just had more practice cleaning up messes," I said. We watched the ripples bend the reflection of the hull. The harbor lights blinked like slow breathing. "When that medal showed up," he said, "people started talking again. The diner crowd, the church folks. I saw the paper. Local commander restores family legacy. I didn't know they'd use a picture of you with Dad. He looks proud." "He is," I said. "You should let him see you again before that pride turns into regret." David's jaw tightened, and then it loosened. "I always thought you left because you didn't care, but seeing what you've done here, I think maybe you left because you cared too much." I smiled. "That's closer to the truth." He pulled something from his jacket pocket. It was a small brass nameplate, tarnished but readable. "Clara H., Rockport." "I found this in the old storage box," he said. "Figured you'd want it." "I think Mom would rather you put it back on the boat," I said. He looked up, his eyes wet in the dim light. "Together?" "Together." We walked to the Clara, tools in hand. The night was silent except for the sea against the pier. When the last screw was tightened, David stepped back and let out a long breath. "She's home again." "Yeah," I said quietly, so are we." The next morning, as the sunlight broke across the harbor, the local news van arrived. I tried to wave them off, but they wanted a statement. "Commander Hale, what made you turn your family's old patrol boat into a rescue craft?" I glanced at David, who was coiling a rope, and then at Dad, who was watching from the doorway with coffee steaming in his hands. "Because service doesn't stop when the uniform comes off," I said. "It just changes shape." The reporter nodded, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. That evening, I scrolled through the local news page. The headline read, "Commander's Return, a new mission for the Clara." Underneath was a photo of Dad, David, and me standing on the dock, the wind in our faces, with the boat right behind us. I turned off the screen and sat outside. The harbor was quiet. Somewhere a gull cried out over the water, and the sound just folded into the calm. I thought of Mark, his laugh, his promise of a porch. Maybe this was the porch he meant, a place where the storms finally break and the sea forgives. The morning after the news story ran, Rockport felt different. Not louder, just gentler. People met my eyes again. Maria at the diner added extra cream to my coffee. On the house. Even Jake and Mike, the kids who'd mocked my paperwork, waved when they passed by on their bikes. Dad called it the tide turning. I just called it remembering. By the middle of the week, the rescue line was ringing nonstop. Fishermen wanted safety checks. Some of the summer tourists wanted to know if they could volunteer. Harris, our old SEAL diver, laughed while he was fixing ropes on the Clara. Guess the Navy's recruiting from Main Street now. That's the idea, I said. Teach them before they forget who's keeping them safe. That afternoon, David came into the shop, wearing the same hoodie he'd worn during our argument weeks earlier. He was carrying 2 thermoses of coffee. "One for you, one for Dad," he said. "A ceasefire?" I asked. "A truce," he corrected. "A ceasefire means nobody won. A truce means we both stop pretending we're losing." We sat on the dock, sipping coffee that tasted more like forgiveness than caffeine. He nudged me. "You ever think about writing all this down? The missions, the whatever this was?" "I've written enough reports to fill a lifetime," I said. "Stories like that belong to the people who made it home." He smirked. "That's the Navy way of saying no, isn't it?" "Maybe," I said, smiling. "Or maybe I'm just not done living the ending yet." That Sunday, the town invited me to speak at the high school's Veterans Day Assembly. I wanted to decline, but Dad insisted. "They need to hear from someone who's been both brave and wrong," he said. "That's what teaches them." The auditorium smelled like gym floor varnish and teenage nerves. Flags hung from the rafters. I stood behind the podium, my hands steady. "I wasn't much older than most of you when I joined," I began. "I thought courage was about shouting louder than your fear. It turns out, courage is about standing still long enough to actually listen to it." They leaned in. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was a kind of respect that doesn't have words yet. I told them about teamwork, about loss, and about the quiet kind of revenge that doesn't destroy, but rebuilds. I spoke of my mother's boat, my brother's mistakes, and the way anger feels powerful until you realize it's just loneliness with good posture. When I was younger, I said, I wanted medals. Later, I wanted silence. Now I think I just want decency to stay in fashion. A little chuckle rippled through the room, but some of the faces softened, especially the veterans in the back row. Before I finished, a student asked, "Ma'am, what does service really mean to you now?" I looked at him, barely 17, his face half hope and half doubt, and said, "Service means showing up. You don't need a uniform for that. You just need a reason." The principal wiped at her eyes. Dad sat in the front row, his hands folded over his cane, looking as proud as any admiral. David leaned against the back wall, smiling for once, like it didn't cost him any effort. After the assembly, people came to shake my hand. One elderly man pressed a folded newspaper clipping into my palm. It was the story of Mark's crash from all those years ago. "My son served with him," the man said. "He talked about you, said you kept calm when everyone else was panicking, said that calm saved their lives." I swallowed hard. "Thank you," I said. That means more than any medal." He nodded. "He said you'd say that too." That night, I walked the shoreline alone. The harbor lights flickered over the water, gold against black. The air smelled like winter coming, cold, clean, and honest. I thought about how my long-held need for revenge had started with anger all those years ago, but it had softened into something gentler and truer. Revenge isn't always about payback. Sometimes it's just about proving that decency can still win, quietly. At the far end of the dock, the Clara rocked in the tide, her reflection broken into 100 moving pieces. The brass nameplate gleamed where David and I had reattached it. Dad's voice echoed faintly in my memory. The tide always turns. I knelt, touched the cold edge of the dock, and whispered, "It finally did, Dad." A gust of wind rolled in, carrying salt and the distant cry of gulls. I could almost hear Mark's laugh in the wind, the one he used when life tried to scare him and failed. When I stood up, the night felt lighter. Not because anything was fixed, but because I'd finally stopped trying to fix it all by myself. I took one last look at the boat, the town, and the quiet harbor that had once forgotten me and now, somehow, remembered. I thought about the people in the assembly hall and the man who knew Mark. It felt important that these stories get told, that we remember the people who served, or even just the people we misunderstood for too long. I was finally starting to understand that honor isn't really about the medals or the newspaper headlines. It's just about showing up, again and again, every time the tide starts to turn.